Hello, my name is Jesan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 51. Today, without a book, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're not going to read a volume today, and I'll be perfectly transparent and honest here. We're not going to read a volume because A, I'm a little bit behind in my reading. Actually, I'm quite a bit behind in my reading. But also, we want to talk with our regular co-host here, Tom Libby, who I kind of dumped on all of y'all, just sort of opened the door and let him in. And I know that he had his initial introduction to us a few episodes ago, but I want to have more of a conversation with him about what his thoughts are on leadership, thoughts on books and book reading and the impact of what you can learn from anybody, which he has mentioned many times on the podcast. And of course, take this opportunity to respond to listener feedback and answer some listener questions, and maybe get to some insights here that leaders can apply to their real lives over the course of this next episode. By the way, you'll know that when I mentioned the number, I said episode number 51. So in our regular counting, we have crossed over the 50th episode mark. That was last week's episode, if you were listening to that. And of course, with our shorts episodes, we are deep into not deep. We just started getting into the 70s on that. So we'll be crossing over into 100 shorts episodes here fairly soon. By the way, we've now begun releasing short little video clips, which you can find on our YouTube channel. The HSCT Publishing YouTube channel, and you can also find our short clips on our Instagram Reels, on my Instagram Reels at Jesan M. Sorrells, or it's Jesan Sorrells or something like that on Instagram. You can see the link in the show notes. And Tom's laughing because I can't remember from Instagram from day one. I think it's also on TikTok somewhere. Someone will take it and put it on TikTok. I'm not on TikTok. If you find me on TikTok, let me know. And you will also be able to see some of these clips on LinkedIn. So we're going to start filming basically our shorts episodes and pulling some small clips from those 6 to 8 minute long observations, ideas, thoughts, or rants, and putting them up for you to be able to access more of the podcast information that way. When you read great books, you learn what it is that paper leaders already knew before you. You get to experience, or you get the opportunity to experience their mistakes without really having to make your own. You allow yourself to behave like an avatar in the world. You get to take on the clothes of Macbeth or the mindset of Joan Didion. You get to view the world through the lens of Nietzsche or Freud. You get to travel cross-culturally, and you get to understand what Dostoevsky may have been struggling with in Russia, or what Amitav Ghosh, the author of The Sea of Poppies, which is our next book upcoming, may be experiencing or may be seeing as he looks at the world through the lens of Indian culture. You also get to experience tragedy, burying my heart at Wounded Knee, or going through the Civil War. You get to know what it is like, to experience tragedy, as well as triumph in times of massive disruption and chaos when you experience great books. I ran across Tom while I was involved in another project, which shall remain nameless. And we started talking a little bit about this project and about our ideas and about our thoughts. And, I was looking for a guy who could come on, who could banter back and forth with me, who could handle being in the maelstrom of my mind, and the maelstrom of all of you all's mind, and thinking about leadership, thinking about sales, thinking about marketing, thinking about business, and thinking about the philosophy of leadership life. I was looking for a person who could bring all of that to you and bring everything together for you. And so that's why I invited on Tom Libby way back in gosh, it would be episode number, I'm gonna have to look that up. I can't remember what episode was the first one that she came in on. I'm gonna have to look that up. But way back in that episode, that first episode that we invited him on in, and I wasn't quite sure how this was all going to go. And by the way, to his credit, he wasn't quite sure either. So we started talking, we started thinking, we started engaging with each other. And what you find out when you engage with people, what you find out when you talk with people, what you find out when people say yes to a project, is you find out, yes, about their level of commitment, and you find out about their level of interest, but you also find out about their level of passion. And in a shorts episode recently, I talked about consistency and time, right? Things take a long time to develop: relationships, ideas, thoughts, processes. Leadership takes a long time to develop. And that's what we're doing here, right? We're demonstrating leadership by role modeling leadership through the sound of my voice, through the nature of our interactions. And so I wanted to talk with Tom today a little bit about what he thinks about the podcast, where he thinks we've been going, how he thinks we've been doing, what are some thoughts he has, like I said, on leadership, on life, on sales and marketing. And I want to give him an opportunity to talk a little bit more about his background and how it relates to all of you all here. So I'm going to cede the floor to Mr. Tom Libby and give him a moment, give him an opportunity, and maybe start off with this question or this prompt, maybe kind of get the juices flowing a little bit. Tom, when you think about books and when you think about leadership, you've been reading books with us and you've been engaged with us around this area since, back in November, when you came on, we talked about Lawrence of Arabia, the biography of Lawrence of Arabia that was written by B.H. Liddell Hart. What have you thought about the book selection? You've now read 3 or 4 or 5 different books with each other. What do you think about the book selection? Have any of these books impacted you? And what would you like the podcast listeners to know about you that they haven't already gleaned before from previous episodes? Let's start with that.
Well, that's kind of that's a really big question. Meaning that we could probably just have the rest of the podcast on that one question alone, right? But
yeah, it'll be like the Kevin Smith podcast. We'll do one question and then we'll talk about that for the next hour.
So let me I'll take it like piece by little pieces at a time, right? So first things first, I've really enjoyed being on the podcast. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I've enjoyed just the thought processes that go behind the books that you select. And this has been very different for me, but on a definitely on a very positive side of different. So I've been very excited about it. Every time I see it come up on my calendar, I kind of get excited that we're going to be talking about, this, that, or the other thing. The thing that I think stands out the most to me is that it's fundamentally different. And what I mean by that is most leadership podcasts and most leadership books and authors and all this, they not that they're all the same. I don't mean it that way, but you're taking books that are not designed to be leadership books. They're not designed to be books that are going to help you learn about business practices, and you're flipping the script on those books, which to me is quite fascinating, right? And I think it's something that you said earlier, a few minutes ago, I should say, just the simple fact that I am a very, very firm believer that you can learn from anyone or from any situation or from any scenario that pops up in your whether it be in your brain or in real life. It doesn't really matter. I really feel very strongly that you can learn from anything or anyone or any situation. So the fact that you're bringing up books like Lawrence of Arabia and books, books like, I think we did Christmas Carol, I think was one of them too, right? Like something like that.
Yes, we did. Yeah.
So these books that are just not designed to be looked at as like, well, what can we learn from that in business, or what can we learn from that in a leadership perspective? And some of the books are fact-driven or historical in nature. Other books are completely, fictitious. So I again, I think from my perspective, I think it's been a lot of fun. It's been fascinating, and I just think that it's been incredibly. It just fits. It just fits me, right? Like the idea behind this just fits the fact that if I really firmly believe that we can learn from anything, then I should be able to join in this conversation with ease. Hopefully, I've done that. Hopefully, I've done that for you and your audience. But
well, it's interesting you talk about flipping the script, because we saw a little bit of that in our Liddell Hart episode, the Lawrence of Arabia episode, where you look at the guy like that, and immediately you're probably going to put him in the space of like great man theory, which was postulated, and I mean, it wasn't postulated, but it was articulated best by Winston Churchill, right? This idea that great men push history, and they push things forward, they push events forward by dint of their personalities. And then there's the rest of us that just kind of follow along in their wake. Now, that was a very Churchillian way of looking at the world, and a Churchillian way of looking at leadership. And you would look at Lawrence of Arabia, and you'd go, that guy was a great man. But he didn't think so. You know, he thought he was just a normal dude. Yeah, British aristocrat, don't get me wrong, but just a normal dude. And so even for him, when he was leading the revolution against the Ottoman Empire, and basically uniting the Arab tribes in World War One, he was looking to flip the script. And I liked how you just used that language. And we saw this with Pearl Buck, right? A book that you know, you were like, I wasn't quite sure. I remember you saying on the episode, I wasn't quite sure what this was. Kind of walk through your thoughts on that, because it was about Wang Lung, and it was about the land, and about famine. And I could tell, you know, and we're doing a video version of the podcast as well as an audio version. We always do. So when I say this, if you're listening to the audio, go watch the video of it if you can find it on YouTube. But I would watch Tom's eyes when I would read an excerpt of the chapter, and he was always very cautious as to he wasn't quite sure what to say next. Would that be accurate?
For sure, because again, like one of the things that not that I'm just to let you know, I'm really in my personal life not a very PC person. I don't tiptoe through things. I say what I think. I don't like, you know, and most of my family and friends, who, by the way, just run the gamut of like race, age, you know, sex, like all that stuff. But if it comes from the place of your heart, and it's not coming from a place of disrespect, and it's amongst friends and family, there's not a lot you can't say, so to speak, right? So, but with that book, I was very hesitant. I was very cautious. I wanted to make sure that that it wasn't taken the wrong way, because if I had something to say that could come across as slightly controversial, I needed to make sure the audience understood that wasn't my intent. Like, that if, you know, so there definitely was hesitation in my eyes, in my heart, in that one.
Well, and that's a good counterbalance for me, because I just kind of go for it. I've already reached the point where, well, if we're going to be controversial, we're going to be controversial. I mean, and the thing is, like, it's controversy, I think, comes when you're inconsistent. Controversy comes when you're inconsistent. We see this as in leadership, right? So if you're inconsistent as a leader, that opens up the door to charges of hypocrisy.
Right.
And everyone, regardless of what position they take on any particular social, political, cultural, religious, whatever issue that they may put ahead of leadership, which I would put leadership ahead of those issues, but okay. Whatever position they may take on those areas, or those topics, or those issues, if there's any sense that there's not consistency in position, everybody hates a hypocrite. I mean, you probably even see this even in your own life. You know, we want intellectual and psychological and emotional consistency. We want that in our leaders. We want that in our arguments. And one of the things you get with the internet is the atomization and the fracturing of everything. And so it seems like there's just inconsistency everywhere, which is why I've never been really all that worried about getting canceled for anything that I've ever tweeted out. I have 26. I've said this before. I have 26,000 tweets. I'm sure there's something objectionable in there.
I'm sure.
Sure, there has to be. at least 15% of those tweets have to be objectionable. And if somebody ever was like, well, you tweeted this out on like March 11th, 2008, and it was a retweet of somebody who turned out to be, I don't know, an eco terrorist that blew up a dam somewhere. I'm like, well, you seemed okay on that day.
Hey, the day I tweeted it, this guy, he was all right.
He was all right.
I can't control what he does after the fact.
That's right. And on that day, he was consistent with what I believed on that. And by the way, I believe the same thing to this day. There's nothing indefensible about anything that I believed in that. But this gets back to something that we also get in books, or not gets back to, but it gets to an idea which also we explore in our books, and we saw it in when we covered did you didn't come over, you didn't come on with me and do Mrs. Dalloway. I don't think you were on that episode. No. But we saw it in Black Indian slave narratives. Again, something that could have been controversial, but we handled it. I think we handled it well. But it's this idea of contextualization, right? Like context matters. And part of the reason why I started this podcast was to get away from the atomization of things. I think we got too much of that. We've overcorrected in the other direction.
I mean, think about it. Even that book specifically, one of the things I really appreciated about it was that the editors didn't take liberty with the language, right? Meaning, like, right. Because in today's culture, there's a lot of cancelization of some of those things, like the way that certain people back in that era, the mid 1800s, the way they spoke, just the English that they spoke, the these, dems, and days, and and they would have been fixed, so to speak, right? Yeah. Because we didn't want to be culturally inappropriate, like we didn't want to make, but that author left that alone, which I just thought was impressive. Well, maybe not impressive, but important. It was definitely. And again, it made sense. It made it right, but they didn't use any kind of PC stuff when they edited it. Like when they went back and said, "Let's make this more palatable for the general population," they didn't do that.
Let's clean it up for the kids.
Exactly, and I just thought that was very well done on their part, on the interviewer's part, and whoever did the editing.
There are people who will listen to this, and they'll say, "Well," or their response will be, "Well, okay, but what about, books that are being removed from libraries, or, and by the way, that's something where, like myself and the ACLU, except in very specific, narrow examples, pretty much align. Like, I think let's have Huckleberry Finn. Like, and Huckleberry Finn's, Mark Twain wrote the language that he wrote for the time in which he was, and you can't I'm going to use a term here, you can't whitewash history. I'm going to use that term. And if we're going to look at Huckleberry Finn, for instance, through a leadership lens, the question becomes, how much truth do you tell your people, and how bald is the language? And that gets us real uncomfortable. We don't want our leaders to have bald language. We want our leaders to do it, to market to us a little bit. We want our leaders to kind of persuade us a little bit. And that gets really nasty, because the truth, well, this is in another book from way back in the day. The truth will set you free, but it'll also irritate you.
Especially the past truths, especially.
Oh, absolutely. And so I'm very much of the thought process that, let's not bring down statues. Let's keep up Robert E. Lee on his horse. Let's do that. But let's also put a statue next to that of whatever you want that represents whatever, historical revisiting of the narrative that you want to have. And let's leave both of them up in the public square.
Yeah, I'm good with that.
Let's leave both up in the public square.
It's interesting living as far north as I do. We don't have those types of controversies. up
Right.
in especially up here in the Northeast, because there wasn't anybody like that
Yeah.
up here that's that controversial. I lied. We recently had, I guess it's the same idea, Christopher Columbus thing, right? So the
Oh,
Christopher
yeah, yeah,
Columbus. So we had a
yeah.
statue of Christopher Columbus up here in our state capitol, and it was removed. The state decided to remove it, and there were some pros and cons on. Well,
Oh, I'm sure.
there's a lot of people that were up in arms about this and that and this and that. Here's my difference, Jesan, and we can move on to some different
Yeah.
topic with you, because obviously this has nothing to do with books and leadership, but
Well, it does have something to do with leadership, because how leadership frames that argument is very important for people. Like, how are they
that's
framing
true.
that?
So when I have been asked it, and again, just for those of you who don't know me and people that have not heard me on this podcast prior, I happen to be of Native descent. So there's a very big movement in the Native community about Christopher Columbus and removing him from pretty much the landscape. And there's obviously people who are on both sides of that coin. The problem with it for me, and you can say what you want about whether he was or wasn't a good or bad person, whether he had indigenous slaves or didn't. There's some writings about it one way back and forth. My only gripe with this, and every time somebody has asked me on whether or not we do something about Christopher Columbus or the statues or whatever, he never stepped foot on American soil. Never So why do we have statues of him?
Right.
On like we have amazing people throughout history, like Gandhi and Mother Teresa and all these other people. If they came and visited the United States and somebody wanted to put a statue at the location that they visited, I'd have no objection to that. Like even take your pick, even bad people, to your point, like Robert E. Lee. If Mussolini came over and visited the United States and somebody put a statue where he visited, okay, at least he was here. But Christopher Columbus never stepped foot on U.S. soil.
That's true. He never made it. That is true. He never made it. He never made it.
So why are we as a country? Why do we have statues about him? I just didn't understand it from that perspective. You can make all the other arguments you want from whatever side of the coin you want, but that argument to me so solidly justifies us not having statues of him and not having Christopher Columbus Day or whatever, right? Like
I would have a statue, but I wouldn't have it in maybe the rotunda of the Capitol of the State House in Massachusetts. I would maybe put the statue outside the Capitol of the State House. I can see an argument to be made from a historical line idea. I can maybe see that. That's and to me that seems like a tenuous argument even there. But there is something to be said for well, no, I'll frame it this way. I think we should have much more of a conversation, and this ties back into the leadership piece. And to your point, how did Christopher Columbus lead his people? So the reason why he didn't get to America was because he went broke. He went broke 5 times.
Right.
He tried 5 times and failed. It is not, he was the, if you really want to frame it this way, he's the ultimate entrepreneur. Like he's the ultimate entrepreneurial example of American failure.
He got seed funding, Series A funding, Series B funding. This guy, he was just a good talker. He was.
He was. He was an excellent salesman.
Exactly.
Now, if we're going to put up a statue and say he was an excellent salesman, I think that is far more historically accurate and far more historically truthful. And then I'm gonna okay, now we've got it. And I think he represents a thread. And I talked a little bit about this in when I talked about the founding fathers last summer in our series where we went through the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the Federalist Papers, the Anti-Federalist Papers. But there's this thread that runs through, and it comes through in Patrick Henry, actually. The guy who's my co-host on that episode said, DeRollo Nixon, he kind of made a parallel between people like Patrick Henry, who go off and live in the hills and you just leave them alone, to an international level, people in Afghanistan that live in the hills and you leave them alone. Like, anytime you go and bother with people in the hills, there's going to be a problem. And there's going to be issues. There's going to be consequences and repercussions as the leader. But I think there's something to be said for also, and this is something else that we talk about on this podcast, the way in which we view leadership is through an American lens. And if you look at Christopher Columbus as a good salesman and nothing more than that, yeah, he was brave. Yeah, he had guts because it was hard. Don't get me wrong. And he went on every single one of those journeys when the ride across the Atlantic was not a picnic by any stretch of the imagination. So he was a salesman with courage. But at the end of the day, he's part of the strain of American culture. Is that enough to have a statue? Your mileage may vary. Tom does not believe it's enough. I can tell by his facial expression, Tom does not believe that's enough. But I do believe it is worthwhile to put it in that context. And again, this gets to our idea of education also on this podcast. How are we educating people to contextualize these thoughts? Not to agree or disagree with us, but to hold these strong views, potentially, loosely. How do you do that and contextualize those views? And books are a great way to do that. A guy who's kind of a parallel to Christopher Columbus, and we're going to move off of this, but a guy who's a parallel to him is kind of Lawrence of Arabia, kind of. Because he's also a guy who just showed up. Now, he did make it, by the way. He did actually make it to the place where he intended to go.
Yeah. There's a noteworthy difference, let's just say.
He did actually make it to where he wanted to go. But he's also problematic, is the kids use the term these days. And I'm an arts major, so I have an arts background. I have a Bachelor in Fine Arts degree. And going through my arts studies in college, one of the classic arguments is, and actually I was watching the Hollywood Reporter YouTube channel this weekend, and they were doing roundtable interviews with directors, and I love watching that kind of stuff because I'm a huge cinema guy, huge movie guy, right? And we never talk about movies on this podcast because it's so big. I forget it. It would drive the podcast off the rails. That's why I discipline myself to not talk about movies. But they were talking in a roundtable with like Mel Gibson and Denzel Washington and Oliver Stone. I can't think of a room with like three more controversial people than that, but who are genuine artists. And they asked the question of them, can you separate the art from the artist? They also had the guy there who wrote the movie, wrote the script for the movie Whiplash, which if you haven't seen Whiplash, it's about J.K. Simmons plays a very exacting drum instructor at a very elite Juilliard level music institution who basically drives a kid over the edge. Which is fabulous. It's a fabulous psychological study about talent and skill and what does that mean. Now, I'm drawing you into the weeds a little bit, but I'm going to make this clear. And I'm going to ask a clarifying question here. When we read books, we see the same kinds of issues. So we see a Joan Didion who had tragedy in her life, but may have somewhat brought that on herself, right? We have a Lawrence of Arabia who, back in World War I, no one was questioning colonialism. Now, forget it. Like, colonialism gets questioned left and right and sideways. We are going to be reading on a future podcast, Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, which was written in direct opposition to Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. And we're going to talk about sort of how these two artists who produced artistic work did or didn't wrestle with social and cultural things. People in history are leaders. They do exist. They exist in their own specific place and time. With the kinds of books that we've been reading on the podcast with you, from Pearl Buck to B.H. Liddell Hart, how do you can we separate can we separate the leader from, not separate the leader, can we separate the art from the artist? And by the same token, then can we separate the leader from his leadership or her leadership? Can we actually do that?
I think, and again, this is just, I would say, I wouldn't say this is factual, but I would say that, just from some perspective or another, I think if you can, they may not be as good of artists as you think they are, or they may not be as good as leader as you think they are, because most times you find that's like saying, like, could you separate Michael Jordan from basketball? Michael Jordan went on to do a lot of other things. He wasn't just a basketball player. He was an entrepreneur. He did but he was also, a Major League Baseball player, so on and so forth. But he was so good at basketball that you could not imagine separating that from his personality or from his bio, right? So I think it's similar, right? I think there's basically, just like everything else, there's probably like, levels of this where somebody is like preaching and teaching, but then going and doing their own thing, and there's like a direct disassociation between the two. And then how seriously do you really take that person, right? And then there's the people that live and breathe and eat and sleep what they say and how they do, and they are embodiment of the person that they portray themselves to be. And you could never separate the two things from that person. Then you got probably some people in between that are they're good on the outside. They put on a good show. P.T. Barnum, The Greatest Showman, like that, put on a good show and he's miserable half the time. You know what I mean? Like, right. So yeah, I think there's that 3-level thing, but I think from just from my perspective looking in, if I'm capable of separating the artist from the art, then they're probably not that great of an artist.
Yeah.
My opinion of them would be that they're only so good, so to speak. It's funny too that you say that about movies, because I absolutely love movies. I'm a huge movie buff too. And this is always what I tell people. When you're watching a really good movie, or you're watching a really good play, or you're whatever, if you see a role that you could never envision anybody else playing except that person, that's the embodiment of the artist being the art, right? Like, because if you can view a role and say, well, I could see, I don't know, let's just pick random people, right? Like, I could see Tom Hanks playing that role, even though he didn't. Like, Tom Hanks is so good, he could play that role. Or I could see, Robert De Niro playing that role. I know it was played by this guy, but De Niro, if you could do that, then that role probably wasn't meant for that person. That artistry is only so good. Whereas I'm as I'm saying this, I'm trying to think of a role that I feel like that about. You know what I mean? But I'm having a hard time thinking of anybody that comes to mind. Well, I watched have you ever seen The Upside with Bryan Cranston and Kevin Hart?
It's been a while.
I just view Bryan Cranston in that, like, who else would I have rather seen in that role?
Okay, Bryan Cranston is a good example. Let's jog off a little bit. That he's a good example, because as an actor, and actors are artists, even though Plato would have eradicated them from the Republic entirely and completely. He thought they were all liars and they were terrible. They were all it's all fakery, basically. He would have eliminated them from his perfect Republic. But Bryan Cranston as an actor is really interesting, because he's been Walter White, but he was also the dad in Malcolm in the Middle.
Right.
And both those roles, like when I heard he was going to be in this show called Breaking Bad, I will be honest, when I heard the premise of the show, like a high school chemistry teacher that sells meth, I was like, the guy from Malcolm in the Middle?
Yeah.
And I squinted my eyes and I went, what? And it wasn't until many years later, or a few years later, after the show had been on for a little while, that I watched a few of the episodes, and I thought, wow, like he really, to your point, embodied that role. That guy's a genuine chameleon. Yeah. And he goes from role to role, which is, of course, why one of the core reasons why, at a serious level, Plato thought actors were untrustworthy, because the genuine ones, the ones who are the genuine article, who are really good at their role, you're right, you can't see anybody else in that role, and yet they'll just slip that off like a snake's skin and put on another one.
Al Pacino in The Devil's Advocate.
Bingo. I love that movie. Yes.
Who could you have seen play that role aside from Al Pacino?
Nobody.
I can't think of anybody.
I mean, De Niro.
Keanu Reeves' character in that movie, I could think of a couple of people.
Yeah. But Keanu Reeves' character was almost a MacGuffin there. Like, they almost didn't need, but then Pacino overdid his overacting thing and his hoo-ha and all that. Pacino, you got to quit. And if you did put another person in there, like Hoffman or De Niro, it's going to be a totally different film. Yeah, it's going to drive it off the rails, right? It's not going to land the same way. So yeah, no, you're right. He does. He embodies that character. You're correct.
Anyway, but that's what I was thinking when you asked that question. That's the problem for me, is I do think there's levels of this, right? And I think that if you are the embodiment of a true artist, I don't see how you separate the art from the artist.
Okay, so is leadership an art?
I think that's a scarier one for me. Well, because you think about it, right? There are occasions where leadership has to be hard-nosed, and you just cannot waver. You have to be, pick a direction and go 100 miles an hour, regardless of what people think is right or wrong. And then there are other situations where you need decision by committee, and you don't want to make that decision without. And is that being disingenuous to who you are? If you have both scenarios pop up and you feel, I don't know. I mean, to me, I think a good leader is somebody who can identify those situations and act on them, versus somebody who has no idea what they're doing and they're just winging it, right? Like, so I think
the art is determining where the art is.
Right, exactly.
Or the talent. I prefer the art. The art is determining where the art is. That's where it is. But then you get into the whole pushback, which now we're going to get into listener feedback. Some of the feedback I get on the podcast is, and early on was, oh, you're reading those books? Those seem really complicated. I could never read those books. Like, okay, well, all right. Then other feedback I get is, well, leadership is more science. And so you're not focusing on the science of the thing, the psychology, the sociology, all of those kinds of aspects. And so literature really isn't that interesting. Or the third type of feedback that I'll sometimes get in general is the feedback of, that's a really cool idea, but those also seem like really complicated books. How is any of that relevant? And so it kind of goes back to this idea of, is leadership an art or a science, right? And I fundamentally think it's both.
I agree with both. Yeah.
But I think the artistic part, though, that's the hard part to find. The writer and author and marketer Seth Godin says, if you have a business that doesn't have a hard part, you don't have a business, you've got a hobby.
Sure, absolutely.
And he's correct. But the hard part is usually, and I would add this on to what he says, the hard part is usually not the obvious part. So in the project that we're involved in, which again, I won't say the name of, because I haven't been authorized to, but the project that we're involved in, some of the people that we're working with on the advisory end of the project, I don't always know, and you and I talked about this initially when we first, talked about me coming on and working with you all. I don't think they always know where the hard part is.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So going back to Christopher Columbus for just a second, I don't think he knew what the hard part was. I think he thought the hard part was convincing the Queen to continue to give him money. That's why he focused on that. He didn't realize that the hard part.
But he succeeded at the hard part then.
but he didn't think he did. That's the horrible thing, because and I would assert that the hard part actually wasn't the hard part. The hard part was getting your whole crew to the actual place where you said you were going to wind up at. That was the hard part.
Well, and he's again the perfect the perfect storm of, you don't know what you don't know.
Don't know, right?
Right. Yeah. So like sailing in that direction, he would have had to have gone the route Magellan went, right?
Right.
And nobody knew that until they started that, that trial by error, so to speak.
Right. Yeah,
Where
exactly.
they just kept going further and further and further down until they got somewhere where they didn't go further north, because they already knew that. They knew there was
Yeah.
no, there was ice. There's nowhere to sail there.
There's
But
nowhere
they
to sail
went,
there.
well, we can keep going south until Magellan finally went around the bottom of South America.
South America.
But to your point though, to go back to the comment of, I think that the things that you're getting feedback on, I think it's interesting that, like, and again, just thinking about the questions that we were asking each other when we were talking about the books that we were, The Lawrence Arabian and Pro Buck and things like that. Because, and you and I would talk about it before we even recorded the podcast, everyone.
Yep.
I'd come on and I'd go, hey, son, what in God's name are you thinking we're taking out in leadership on this book? And then he'd just ask a question that I went, aha, like the light bulb went off. I was like, all right, I get it now. I get where you're going with this. And so it's not that they're not there. I think what people fail to understand with that feedback that you just said, what you're getting, is you want the round peg in the round hole. And I'm sorry to tell everybody, but that just simply is not life.
Yeah,
right?
no.
Like, to find circumstances where the round peg fits in the round hole firmly, completely, with, unequivocally, and it, like, that might happen a couple times in your life. Like, everything else is trying to fit a round peg in a square hole, or a square peg in a round hole. And by the way, you have to get it done. Like, you can't just say, well, that's square and this is round, it's never going to work. You can't. You have to figure out a way to get the round peg in the square hole. And if that means sanding down the round peg to make it smaller so that it fits, fine, then that's what you do. But I think that's part of what people are missing out on, if they're already coming to the table with, I can't see how you're going to get leadership out of Pearl Buck, or I can't see how you're going to get leadership out. I'm telling you, people, you can find whatever you are searching for in just about anything you want to read. It's just a matter of opening up your mind and not allowing strict and stringent processes to take hold of you, and allow yourself to think abstractly, right? And allow yourself to think outside the box. Allow yourself to have things impact you and affect you, because that's the other part of leadership. Like you said, it's half art, half science. Well, guess what? On the art side, you might get your feelings hurt and you have to adjust something to it. That's leadership, knowing that you don't allow your feelings being hurt to dictate how you treat other people, knowing that you're going to get your toes stepped on, or somebody above you or below you is going to contradict something you say, and how you react to that matters. That's not science. That's an art form that you have to know yourself better than the science books knows you, like that,
That's
so to speak. So anyway, I could probably ramble for a while. But
No. I mean, we kind of talked a little bit about this in our episode. I think it was episode number 41, where we talked about Persuasion by Jane Austen, right? You're going to learn more about emotional intelligence from Jane Austen, or at least maybe I won't say more. I'm going to hedge my language here. You're going to learn just as much about emotional intelligence from Jane Austen as you would learn from Daniel Golman, the researcher who's been writing about emotional intelligence for the last 35 years. Great work, by the way. I've got Daniel Golman books on my bookshelf. I've referenced Daniel Golman books in my training, in my development, in my consulting work, also in books that I've written. Dan Golman is fabulous. I don't have a problem with Dan Golman. And you're going to get more out of Jane Austen. Read Persuasion. Read Persuasion. And by the way, if you can't figure it out because of the language, or because of the word barriers or things like that, pick up the annotated copy where everything is explained to you. I mean, it doubles the size of the book, but everything is explained to you in there. So there's no dearth of knowledge, right? And that gets to maybe one other piece of feedback which we sometimes get, which is, and we're sort of beginning to address this year. How do you move from, and this is a question for you, Tom, how do you move from reading about leadership to actually taking action in being a leader? How do you move to taking action? And that's actually one of our mottos our motto for 2023 on the podcast is take action. You can read all day. And by the way, I love reading too. I love watching movies. Tom clearly loves reading and watching movies, love all of that. But moving from absorption to execution and doing that consistently. How do we do that for folks? And that's a legitimate piece of feedback, by the way.
Yeah, so I think this is an interesting one. To be honest with you, Jesan, I think this one actually could be its own podcast all by itself, just this one question, because I think there's so many different methodologies, so many different ways of doing things that I don't think there's one right or wrong way to do just about anything, unless you're putting something together from IKEA that says put bolt A into hole B, and if you don't, then you can't sit on your couch, like,
yeah.
but I mean,
or the people from the sweet, they'll show up at your house with Swedish meatballs.
Yeah, exactly.
I have failed at putting together IKEA furniture in my time.
I spent the first 10 years of my professional career in restaurants.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a good, there's a reason I say this, by the way, because as I was saying, we're talking about, like, I couldn't tell you how many times I've seen a chef make a meatball differently than the one before him or her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I had to, in my 10-year career, I had to have seen 1,000 ways to make a meatball. And I'm not even exaggerating, 1,000 different ways to make a meatball. And every time I tried that meatball, it was fantastic. So how can you say that one way is right and one way is wrong, right? So, and what you're talking about, how do you learn something and then implement something? I read a book, I think I referenced it once on one of the episodes I was on with you, a book by the guy by the name of Jeff Olson, and it was called The Slight Edge, right?
The Slight Edge, yep.
The Slight Edge. And I don't know if you had a chance to read it or if you've ever read it, but one of the lessons that he teaches in this book, which I find just fundamentally and rooted in truth, and that nobody ever pays attention to, but if they did, the world would be a better place, is that you don't have to make drastic, impactful changes overnight. Like, you don't have to wake up tomorrow and say, I'm going to be a hard-nosed, straight-line leader tomorrow because I've been wishy-washy for the last 10 years. And tomorrow I'm going to wake up, it's going to be my way or the highway, and that's it. Or vice versa, right? You've been a hard-line leader your whole career. Tomorrow you want to wake up and say, tomorrow I'm going to be decision by committee. And where I'm never going to make a decision hardcore ever again. It doesn't need to be that. And if you read the book by Jeff Olson, what he talks about was small incremental improvements make you a better person as you go, because the adjustments that you make, if they're small incremental adjustments, they don't have to be right away. Mm-hmm. You can make an adjustment. Again, tomorrow I have 18 things I got to do. I'm going to pick one. And I'm going to try this decision by committee thing and see how it goes. Mm-hmm. I'm going to take one decision, not all of them, one. I'm just going to take one and see how it goes. And that goes really well. So the next day you're going to take two. The next day you're going to take three. The third day it fails. You don't like it. So you don't have to make a change tomorrow to day 4. Like it doesn't work that way. He writes something in the book I thought was fascinating too. Like when he talks about the lunar module that goes to the moon and actually lands on the moon, it was only directly on course 3% of the time. 97% of the time it was making slight adjustments to come back on course, right? That's the way space works. If you know how space travel works, you thrust it, thing starts floating. It doesn't stop. There's no stop. So you have to thrust it back and thrust it back. Yep. He talks about it like, it's these, so 97% of the time you could be off course as long as the 3% gets you to the destination that you're expecting to get to. You have to learn for the rest of the way. Like, it's about learning that 97% and learning what's not working, learning what's not putting you on track, and making the adjustment to pull you back to the 3%. And don't be afraid. That's the thing. Don't be afraid to make that adjustment and move and allow yourself the freedom of making the adjustment as you go.
Well, we've even seen this on the podcast. I mean, we've seen this with the episodes that we've done. We've done 100 and something, 40 some odd episodes of this podcast, up to almost total, between shorts episodes and regular episodes and bonus and special one-offs and interviews and all that other kind of stuff, right? And the average podcast doesn't make it past 8 episodes, which is insane.
Yeah.
The average new podcast in the last 2 years doesn't make it past 8 episodes. Most podcasters that are doing well, the podcasters that my listeners have heard of. So I'll name names: Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson. If you're in the comedy space, a Mitch Joel or a Bill Burr, those guys who are doing those types of podcasts. Or even if you're in the marketing space, like a Seth Godin or a Mitch Joel, right? Or if you are in the entrepreneurship space, Entrepreneur on Fire, John Lee Dumas. My God, that guy's probably up to almost 1,000 podcasts, and they've built. There's this idea in business that you, and in entrepreneurship, that you find a spot, right? And you begin to build a silo that's basically, impenetrable. You build a silo straight up in the air. Think about it visually that way. And then you do what Facebook has done so brilliantly. You build a moat around that. And anything that tries to steal your silo, and in the Facebook example, I'll use Instagram, that tries to steal your mojo, you basically go out there and you pull it across your moat, and then you increase your moat by purchasing it or acquiring it, and then you build a bigger moat. Podcasts do the same thing. So, I won't use Joe Rogan because it's one that everybody knows. NPR, any podcast that you've ever listened to that's produced under the realm of NPR, this is everything from How I Made This all the way to not Business Wars, not them, but How I Made This to Prairie Home Companion, right? The silo there is all those NPR shows that show up for free on the radio. That's the silo. It's a silo of content. It's hundreds and hundreds, almost millions of hours of content going back to the 80s, the 90s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And they could just dump. The silos are very, very large and very, very tall. And if I want to do an NPR type show, to Tom's point, I could be 97% off course, but my 3% has to be accurate if I'm going to go get that silo, right? If I'm going to play in that silo. Most people don't understand that in podcasting terms. They don't get that. And so to get to 100 episodes, I will tell you, out of our 140 episodes, sure, 97% of them I'm probably dissatisfied with. There's something in there that I'm dissatisfied. I could find something, from the show notes to the conversation that I had to the points that I made to I hit this or I didn't hit that, or my pauses weren't in the right space or whatever. But the core ideas in that 3%, which is kind of the things that we've been talking about, the core ideas of the proof being in the pudding and embodying leadership and looking at people as leaders. And of course, Tom's core idea of being able to learn from anyone, anytime. That's part of that 3%. That's all you got to do to keep on track. So I love that. I love that idea because it applies to the podcast too.
I had a conversation with somebody the other day, something about their business. The details are not that important, but it reminded me of something because my son and I, and this goes back to the 3%. So my son and I my youngest son is 23. Mm-hmm. And he was going through some sort of existential crisis that he didn't know what he wanted to do with his life. Like, he thought that by 23, he should have had all this figured out. Like, then he knew it, So I was asking, I said, what was I doing when I was 23? Like, do you know what I was doing when I was 23? And he's like, no. I go, I had just finished culinary school. I was working in restaurants. I was in restaurants and stuff like that. I go, do you know what I do now? I was like, I didn't figure out I went to school. I spent 10 years in the restaurant business before I figured out I really didn't want to do this.
I really don't want to do this.
And then I went in and I got some random sales job and ended up falling in love with it. And now I'm a sales and marketing consultant, right? Right. So I was trying to explain to him that you just have to pick something and go, because you don't know what you don't know yet. You don't even know if you like the profession that you think you like. You could love to. He's a fiddler, right? Like, he loves to fix things, and he's very creative. He loves to create. He does like leather work, and like he does a lot of like stuff, right? Like, very hands-on. I go, but if somebody told you had to do that every day and that's how you're going to make your money, you might fall out of love with that, because now it's not a labor of love. It's not something you love to do. It's something you have to do. So He did. He went to work for a company called Tandy Leather, which, by the way, is based in Texas. But that's not important either. I just said that for Jesan's point. So so he went to work for a company called Tandy Leather. 4 years later, realized, I don't like doing. I can't be pressured to do this. I can't.
Right.
I enjoy doing it when it's on my time, when it's a hobby, but I can't work in this environment for a living. It took him. I gave him credit. Now he's thinking, I just wasted 4 years of my life, and I went, you did it faster than me. I spent 10 years in the restaurant industry.
Right.
Like, you only spent four years. Like, you figured it out way faster than I did.
It's that trial and error thing that Magellan did. And
right. Keep going south until we made it, right? So my point to that was back to the 3%, right? Like, it's easy for us. It's easy for us as parents to look at our kids and say, don't worry about it. You don't need your life figured out at 23. You can work through some things. You can work through it. You can work through it. But it's not okay for us as leaders to stop and think that we might be on the wrong path. And so it's almost like we have this double-edged sword that we always play with, right? It's like, I can do and say this when I'm at home, and I can do and say this when I'm at work, but God forbid they cross paths, right?
Right.
But again,
right. Well, books teach you the value of consistency. They should anyway, right? I mean, I think of in January we covered we read the books Play It As It Lays, right, by Joan Didion, right? Because we read Didion and we read Virginia Dalloway and all that. And one of the interesting things that I find to be interesting about Didion, and we're going to cover all of Didion's corpus eventually on this podcast, because I'm just fascinated by her and her writing. I think she was an incredibly incisive chronicler of the chaos of the latter part of the 20th century through a sociocultural lens. And as she put it, she was seeking to find meaning for her art, find meaning for her writing, because she, as she wrote in the introduction to Slouching Towards Bethlehem, she wrote that book or wrote those series of essays during a time where she didn't think her art had any meaning with all the chaos that she saw happening all around her. That through line, right, of art, and that through line of culture informs leadership, and it makes us better leaders. Like, I fundamentally believe that. And that kind of brings us around to another piece of feedback that I get, which when I talk about the podcast on other podcasts, and I've been on other shows about the podcast, and I've been interviewed about it, and you can find all those other interviews floating around the internet, and you just Google my name and they're gonna pop up. But one of the questions that I often get asked is, why are you doing this podcast? Like, what's the real reason? And the palatable, publicly acceptable reason, I'll give you all three of them, but the palatable, publicly acceptable reason is, well, I really like books. It's really cool to really love literature, because I do. I love literature and I love books, and and that's a true reason. If I'm pressed a little bit, I'll say, maybe the second reason, I wanted to find something that interested me enough to be able to go past 100 episodes. And I'm always going to have great books. And we could talk about, maybe what the word great means. And I've already done an apologia for the great books, because I do believe in the great books. I do believe in that idea of a great books curriculum. I do believe that there are, and we talked about this on the podcast with Pearl Buck. There's so many voices that you need to hear. And we can expand the canon or contract it, but there does have to be a canon. Like, we have to curate, because there's just too much. So that's the second reason. But the third reason is, and this is the grandiose reason, and I very rarely talk about this, I do think we are at a pinnacle moment in our cultural history as Americans, where if the fundamental decisions that leaders make, and this is to your point about a leader being consistent everywhere, if leaders aren't consistent everywhere, and if they aren't informed on how to take action to maintain that consistency everywhere, I believe that we are at very, very precarious times right now, that you kind of only come through maybe once in an 80-year or 100-year cycle, where the decisions that I make and the decisions that Tom makes and the decisions that the people that Tom consults with and the people that I consult with, people that listen to my podcast, And the people who listen to my podcast and then tell other people about it, it spreads by word of mouth and by downloads. And thank you all for your downloads and for your word of mouth. Those kinds of decisions need to be informed by things that are fundamentally grounded, and books fundamentally ground us, because if they're not, then we're just going to get more chaos, and chaos leads to the end of a culture and the end of a civilization. And I don't want my voice to contribute in any kind of way to the continued fracturing of that. I just don't. And the podcast has to serve the building of that foundation. And the best way to do that is through things that are timeless, which is literature. Tweets aren't going to get us there.
It's so funny that you say that, because my daughter is in school right now. She's a psychology major, which makes most things fascinating when I talk with her, but like we're talking about, and you're talking about the whole grounded point, right? Mm-hmm. In her brain, what makes me a good leader, this is not anything to do with me, because her and I talk about this stuff too. What makes me a good leader or a good business person or a good salesperson, because in her brain, all three of those things are the same, right? Mm-hmm. Like, because it's really just about being yourself and being who you are. It's not about finding something you're good at. No, that will find you eventually if you're doing the right things and being the right way. But she talks about the whole well-roundedness. Like, you could stick. In her mind, I don't necessarily agree with this, by the way. So I'm just taking an observation from her. But she's like, Dad, she's like, you could stick you in a room full of anybody and it wouldn't matter, because the well-roundedness part of you is, if somebody wants to talk about literature, you have a favorite book. If somebody wants to talk about movies, you have a favorite movie or favorite actor, favorite actress, whatever that case may be. You want to talk about sports? No problem. I love sport. She's like, it's that whole, and I love this. I think, I don't remember if you and I talked about this or not, Jesan, but I know I talked about it with my son recently too, and my daughter. One of the most common phrases that drives me bananas is, well, don't be a jack of all trades.
Oh no, we've never talked about this. No.
So if you listen to the entire comment, and I don't remember it verbatim, but you guys can look it up. Look up the actual comment. It's it's about a master of a jack of all trades, a master of one, but a master of one gets the job done, or it's something like that.
Something like that.
It's quite the opposite that we think it is. People say, well, you don't want to be a jack of all trades. Like, you need to, or you should. No, you don't want to be a jack of all trades. You do want to be that master of one. Like, it's like, so I guess, to your point about the well-roundedness piece is like, but the way that sinks into other parts, I think, is important. Meaning, I like opening and experiencing different things. I like being exposed to the arts, to the opera, to theater, to musicals and movies and books and TV and like all these things. I also like being exposed to good conversation. I like being around people that are smarter than me. I like being around people that are more intellectual than I am. And that goes in every facet too. Whether you're talking to a mechanical engineer or a psychology major or somebody who is a rocket scientist, I don't care. It doesn't matter. They have insights that you'll never think of. But if you can start talking to them and start adapt, like it makes your brain work different. It really makes your brain work different
It does.
And then you walk out the door of the networking event that you're at. You walk out the door, you go into the sports bar, and the Houston Astros are playing, and you're like, yeah, I didn't realize that guy was still on the team. I thought he retired last year. And people are like, oh, or like, I don't know, the Dallas Stars or whatever. If you're a hockey fan or whatever, right? Like, it's like, but I really do think that, and I think that people who silo themselves are at a loss. They are at the disadvantage. If I walk into a room and I know absolutely nothing about the topic being discussed, then I can't participate in that conversation, right?
Right.
So if I am a sports person and I don't care about the arts, and I walk into a room full of, let's just say, venture capital people who are all talking about the opera or talking about the latest, greatest musical on Broadway or whatnot, and I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about.
Right.
Why do you want to be that person? I think, to your point, and again, same thing, like when I talk about, decision by committee, my daughter's very quick to point out that I never make decisions like that. But what I do is I will absorb as much information as I can get from any avenue I can get it. So it's not truly decision by committee, but the decision I make, I want to make sure it's an informed decision, that I get input from everybody. Right. So I'm not making the decision based on what you guys think. I'm basing the decision on all of the collective data that I can retain from everywhere I can get it. And that's different than decision by committee.
Right.
So
yeah, it is. It is. Yeah. Well, and it comes down.
But I do that everywhere, by the way. That's what I wanted to say. Like, even in my personal life, when I'm deciding to buy that new car or to buy what, I do the same thing. I do the same thing in my personal life that I do in business, is what I was getting at. But sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I tend to be an information, like Google is the greatest thing ever for me. Like, hoovering up data is ridiculous. But then at a certain point, to our point about this year, too much data is, at some point, too much data is just too much information. You have to make a decision. And by the way, I love what you said there. You have to pick something. It's interesting. I'm talking to a lot of high school students who are like graduating in various aspects of my personal life. And the one thing that cuts through, particularly with, and I know they're called Gen Z, I'm just going to say this, the younger generation of folks, is they have been raised in a world of almost an overwhelming smorgasbord of options. And that leads to a very distinct form of decision paralysis, what we in business call, paralysis by overanalysis. And the inability to cut the cord and make the decision because every vista is open is something that's really challenging. And the thing is, when you read a piece of literature, the vista that opens up for you is a vista that you don't necessarily have to take a risk to experience. You just can put it down and go off and go do something else. That's why Didion is interesting. That's why Amitav Ghosh is interesting. That's why Joseph Conrad is interesting. I'm not going to go probably to Nigeria, right? I'm probably not going to go to tribal Nigeria, but I want to have that option. In reading Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, I want to have that option to go and experience that thing and then put it down. And to your point, go into the networking meeting or go into the sports bar. And do I have to talk about Chinua Achebe at the sports bar? No, I don't. I don't have to talk about it. But you know what? If a commercial comes on that's advertising like a Zales diamond, and everybody's like, "Oh, I'm going to get my girlfriend a Zales diamond. Like, we're going to get engaged," and the guy next to him goes, "Well, those are all blood diamonds." I can go, "Well, technically speaking." And now we can go into something else, right? Or if I'm in that networking meeting with people who are talking about the opera, and my only exposure to opera has maybe been a punchline on Frasier, the old show from back in the 90s that they are now rebooting, by the way, with Niles and Frasier and, the stuffy, fussy, sort of Seattle arts crowd. Yeah, I might feel a little put out. I might not have the recall to be able to engage with that. But if my engagement with opera has been beyond maybe the Bugs Bunny Looney Tunes level, and I've actually been to go see Pagliacci, thank you, we can have a conversation about that. And so I think in the world of the internet, with the explosion of options, and particularly the younger generation, that sense of when to choose to be a generalist versus choosing to be very specific, that decision-making process, I think, is broken. And books help us repair that. I think books help us pull that back together. We're going to turn the corner here. Because we talked about feedback, we talked a little bit about sort of your impetus for being on the show, my impetus for having you on the show. This is a good 51st episode kind of thing. So we're going to do something a little bit special here that we wouldn't do in any normal episode. And I already said this is not a podcast about movies. Maybe I'll do leadership lessons from the great movies. Maybe that'll be the next one.
I definitely want to be on that one. I'm just letting you know that one right up front.
10 years from now. we'll design it. We'll launch it 10 years from now. Okay. I will go by decade. By the way, I go by decade. So I'm about to ask you this question. So give me your top 5 movies of all time. Like if you're on a desert island, and by desert I mean like Tahiti, top 5. And this is a John Cusack high fidelity. You know that scene.
Stressful. This is I don't know if I can do this.
Ladies and gentlemen, his face is turning red. He's now grabbing his cheeks. His eyes are doing that squinty thing. He's thinking hard.
So
top 5 desert island films.
I don't know if I could pick 5, honestly.
You got to pick 5.
Let me just tell you why. It's a genre thing, right? Like,
yeah.
So,
oh yeah,
so
I get it. Yeah.
Like, I don't. I would have to pick 5 from each genre. Like I couldn't pick just 5. I'd put up a fight here.
Oh, you're gonna fight?
I'm gonna put up a fight to how many movies I can have on the island. No,
you can only have 5. You can't have any more than 5. No more than 5 DVDs.
Okay, so I think I would have no choice. My Cousin Vinny is probably one of my favorite comedies of all time. I think
that's a good solid comedy.
I think and if you know anything about the law, if you've ever been to law school, my sister went to law school and they actually made them watch that movie in law school. So there's
yes.
For the factual part of it, not like because they thought that no, there's things in which they do in that movie that you don't see in legal movies, but they're actually right. Like they did it right. Whoever did that. Anyway, that's not why I watch it. I watch it just because I think that Joe Pesci and Marissa Tomei are the most hilarious couple. I mean, let's face it, right? So it would have to be that. I think the first Predator movie would have to be on there.
Oh.
Because I think from a cinematography standpoint, I think it was fantastic for its era, for when it came out in the late 80s. It came out in the late 80s.
And it was in that weird middle ground between Alien and everything that happened with T2, with Cameron, where Cameron like sort of blew the doors open on digital. So it was still in that weird area where like they were experimenting and they weren't quite sure what they were.
So and then Devil's Advocate, I think would have to be up there. I think that was probably one of my favorite movies of all time.
By the way, I love Pacino's line in there. Are we negotiating?
Oh, that's my favorite line of the whole movie is he's an absentee landlord. My favorite line. I was like, you got to be kidding me. Anyway, all right. So what else? I would say, again, really more for the
You've only got 2 left. You only got 2 spots left on that plane.
I know. I think Rocky 4 would have to be in there.
Okay.
And again, it's not so much that's more nostalgic for me than anything else, because the time frame that it came out, I was very influential in that like, so in the Cold War was still happening.
Cold War,
and, you know, like
the big Russian,
the Rocky 4 kind of impacted me as a kid. Like when I first saw it, I thought it was a crazy movie. So that, and then the 5th one, honestly, it's a newer movie, but I think either one of the 2 Avatar movies, and again, that's just pure for cinematography, like the way the CGI worked, and like and the storyline. If you take the CGI and the alien part out of it, it's colonization. It's like that is is basically what happened to Africa and the United States is in that movie. That's why all of the aliens are played by Native Americans and African actors.
So
West
I call
and you know, those guys, like, it's crazy.
Do you remember Fern Gully?
Love that movie. Love it.
That's Avatar. The Avatar is Fern Gully. That's basically what that movie is.
but Fern Gully happened right here in the rainforest. Like, it was the same idea. Yeah.
It's freaking on another planet.
Yeah, exactly.
Fern Gully on another planet.
Now that being said, like I said, you know, there are other movies that if I had to do this all over again, like if I had to go and say, you could only have animated movies. Like I could probably pick 5 animated movies that I could watch forever, you know.
Right.
whether it was, 101 Dalmatians or Aladdin or whatever, like those kinds of Disney kind of Pixar. And I also think that from a horror movie perspective, there's that whole genre. I could probably pick just 5 from that genre. I mean, Amityville Horror, both Amityville Horrors, the original one in the 1970s and the one that Ryan Reynolds did in the early 2000s, both of them were amazing. Absolutely amazing. Amazing acting in it. Ryan Reynolds was incredible in that movie.
Deadpool? I'll be honest.
Yes, right. Deadpool he played a guy that goes berserk. He gets, anyway, yeah.
Well, that's not a far leap for him.
Evil berserk, though.
Evil berserk. Yeah. Horror is one of those genres that I've long had a hard time getting my arms and hands around. And maybe it's probably a combination of a bunch of different things. Sure. I'll admit that have nothing to do with the genre, have everything to do with me. But I will say that The Shining for me, like that's forget it. Like, but you know what? It took me a long time. I'll be honest. It took me a long time to get my arms around Kubrick films in general. It took me a long time with him because I couldn't. There were things he was doing in film I couldn't tolerate. I was like, what do you like? There's an entire sequence in Dr. Strangelove, where they're building up to the fight in the war room, where I'm just like, this is 20 minutes of ridiculousness. What are you doing? Or classic problem with Kubrick, Clockwork Orange. It took me 10 times of watching that film to figure out what the hell he was doing. And I worked as a projectionist for a little while, and we got an original, the theater that I was working at the time in Michigan, in a city that shall be named later, working at an old school art film studio, or not art film, but art cinema place. And I was the projectionist, and we got in an old school silver nitrate print of A Clockwork Orange. And I watched it, and I watched it because you had to watch, as a projectionist, you watch the film to make sure you wound it correctly and all that. And those old school silver nitrate films, those are all falling apart. That's why Scorsese's on film preservation, and almost any good director really is, because you lose so many old films, and film transfers are just horrible, and a lot of films just fall apart in storage. It's disgusting what happens to physical film, but particularly that silver nitrate film from back from like the 20s all the way through the 70s is just horrible. But anyway, watch this print, and I was literally sitting in the theater by myself watching A Clockwork Orange, and I thought, oh, I get this now. Now this makes sense. What? Because I'd always watched it on TV or on like back in the day of VHS or whatever, and I couldn't grasp what he was trying to do with the story. So it took me a long time to get my arms around Kubrick. But once I did, I was like, oh, okay. Yeah, all right. You're one of the top 5 directors.
Once you get the style, you get it. Jordan Peele's the same way.
Yeah, there
Jordan
you go.
Peele's another guy that, like, if you don't get it, you're never gonna. You just don't get it. Like, you have to watch his movies and really kind of, you got to really dive headfirst into them.
I'm on the bubble with him. I don't know what he's doing. But I'm on the bubble with a lot of modern, and by modern I mean last 20-year directors. I'm on the bubble with a lot of them because I can't really figure out. Well, no, not I can't figure out. There's been such shifts in the culture that are informing their art.
Yeah.
That some of which I fundamentally disagree with. That it's hard for me, talk about separating the art from the artist. It's hard for me to separate the culture from the art, or the culture from the direction. Sure. And I'll admit that, my kids even know, like, Dad doesn't watch new things. Or Dad struggles with new things.
his movie, Jordan Peele's movie Nope was good. It was just,
you thought that was good?
It was good because it was really different. It was really different. Like, and again, if you like that genre, you'll understand what I mean, because it seems like all of the alien movies follow a certain pattern. And this didn't. This did not follow that pattern. It was just different. It was very different for me.
I thought it was fine. The first act was okay. Then he did the weird turn in the second act with the Asian
the Asian cowboy
guy. I'm not giving too much away because the movie's been out for a while now. No spoilers, go see it.
Yeah.
And after that, I kind of lost I'll be honest, I lost the plot I lost the thread. And I thought, I was sitting there with a buddy of mine, and I thought, I leaned over to him, and I go, it's the director's responsibility to keep me in this. And the director has now dropped the ball.
No, he didn't. He didn't though. See, that's what I'm saying. Jordan Peele movie, he does that on purpose. Because there's this, I forget what the methodology is. There's a methodology where, like you just said, first act, very good. Second act, kind of bizarre. Third act, you're really lost. Fourth act really pulls it all together. Like,
oh, he's doing a 4-act structure. Okay.
So if you look at the very last part of the movie, like the last 10 minutes, 15 minutes, you're like, yeah. Oh, that's why the Asian cowboy was there. Oh, that's why that went like that. Oh, now I get why the sister reacted this way.
Then it was on me. It was on me. Then I was the one that failed. I was the one that failed to film, not Jordan.
No, I think a lot of people get like that with his films, though, because again, he does that a lot in his films. But if you at the point where you feel like you're starting to lose interest, if you decide to pay attention even closer, you'll definitely get Jordan Peele movies.
Okay. All right. That's the most compelling explanation of what he's doing that I've heard from anybody yet. Most people can't tell me what he's doing. So that was no,
I like him. I like a couple of it. Did you see the one? Oh, I just lost the name of it. The one where the kid goes home with the it's a mixed race couple, so white girl, black guy, and he goes home with her. And Get Out.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
I did not see Get Out. No.
Oh my God, fantastic movie. Jordan Peele, he did it again. Great job. And again, he did the same thing you're talking about.
Okay.
You get the first act and you're like, oh, looks like a normal family. Oh, it's like this whole now do they just not like black people? No, they love black people, but they love them a little too much. Like it's like and then you find out why all those things happen, and you're like, oh shoot,
it's like eating Raoul broke out.
yeah. But anyway, yeah.
Okay. So in the interests of I don't know, parody, I will give my top 5.
Yes, I was going to ask you anyway. Go ahead.
Yeah, I know you were. So top 5 films for Jesan on a desert island. Number 1 is going to be Citizen Kane. I can watch Orson Welles over and over and over and over again, and I can always get something new out of that movie, from the camera angles to the set design. Orson did everything first, other than D.W. Griffith. He did everything first. He just did, and we're all sort of still following in the wake of him. And what makes it even better is he then completely fell off the table, kind of after Citizen Kane. He has that one movie that he did where what's his name? Charlton Heston plays against type in Mexico. And then, you're done. And then it's just terrible. And so I like the story of Orson Welles, as well as the film Citizen Kane. It's so wrapped up with contemporary ideas about truth and modernism and justice. Anyway, Citizen Kane's always going to be, and it's on a lot of people's number 1 lists for a whole variety of different reasons. So I'm not unusual in that.
Not at all.
I would definitely put Citizen Kane in there. Then my number 2 is going to be a film that's probably going to be a little bit outside the box for most folks, but I was talking about it with my daughter the other day. The Royal Tenenbaums, Wes Anderson's Royal Tenenbaums. I identify with Gene Hackman in that. That's how I'm going to be when I'm a grandfather. I'm going to be just like Gene Hackman. It's going to be amazing. Getting out there and mixing it up, throwing eggs at cars with my grandkids. And there's an entire sequence. If you haven't seen it, you should go check it out. Alec Baldwin does the voiceover. It's got Ben Stiller in it. Gwyneth Paltrow in one of her better roles, where she's not just sort of hanging around, and I'm wondering why she's not part of the wallpaper. He actually utilizes her, which is stunning. And of course, Luke Wilson and Owen Wilson. But Luke Wilson is actually in a role where he doesn't seem to suck all the air out of the room and leave everybody else just sort of gasping as an actor. Wes Anderson seems to have a good hold on him. And Royal Tenenbaums was the movie that was one of the last films that Wes Anderson directed before Sofia Coppola got a hold of him and sort of pushed him in a particular directorial direction. But there's a great sequence in Royal Tenenbaums where Gene Hackman and Danny Glover are going at it. and Gene Hackman says to him, "You want to talk some jive?" I'll talk some jive. And then the dad goes, oh, talk some jive. It's these two old men, and they're having an old man fight. And it's amazing. It is absolutely amazing. It's a meditation on age, on gender, on race, on family relationships, and ultimately on death. And what makes it even better is Gene Hackman is retired from acting, and he's still alive. He's retired from acting, but like he went on a high note, and that was one of his last films that he did. So that would be my number 2. So Citizen Kane, Royal Tenenbaums. Then I would take something from the 60s, which I'm not much known for romantic comedies. Pillow Talk, Rock Hudson and Doris Day from back in the day. A quirky little film that you wouldn't think would work, but it's sort of one of the last romantic comedies that came out of the studio system, and it's light and frothy and airy and all of that. And you can see Doris Day actually acting, and you can see Rock Hudson actually acting, and you can see the strings, and they kind of wink and they kind of nod at the camera, and they see the strings and they know you see the strings. But it comes out of a sense of irony that's palpable but not overwhelming, like you see in most modern romantic comedies. So Royal Tenenbaums, Pillow Talk, Citizen Kane. Then 2 that are kind of going in opposite directions, but both came out of the 90s. So Fight Club, that was a movie that was incredibly influential for me in 1999, when I was like, how old was I in 1999? Like 18 when that movie came out. My God, that movie blew me away when I went and saw that in the theater. I was stunned.
I was so disappointed. I figured out what the concept was so early that I was really frustrated. I was like, he's fighting himself. I don't understand. Why is this? I was so frustrated. My daughter refuses to watch movies with me now, by the way. Like,
yeah, I bet. Yeah,
because she's like 15 minutes into the movie, I'm like, oh, that's gonna be this and that, and that's gonna happen there. And she's like, why do I watch movies with you? She's like,
shut up.
Yeah. Anyway, but Fight Club was one of those for me. I watched the first 15 minutes of it. I was like, come on, like.
But it was part of the triumvirate of films in the late 90s that sort of set the table for the 2000s. So Fight Club was one. Then The Matrix was number 2.
Oh, The Matrix was a good one. Yeah.
You got a lot of overlap between those 2. And then weirdly enough, the third one, which is actually my 5th film, Braveheart.
Yeah.
I remember watching that. I was maybe 15 or 16 when that movie came out. And I had just started getting into film, so I wasn't really paying attention to like Academy Awards and that kind of stuff. And when it came out, I had heard about it vaguely or whatever, but then I went and rented it from Blockbuster, and I remember watching it one afternoon. And my grandma, God rest her soul, she watched Oprah every afternoon at 4:00, and you did not interrupt her Oprah time. Like, you just did not do it. And Braveheart's 4 hours. So
that's how I know I'm getting old, because that for me is Jeopardy. Every night, like clockwork. Do not touch the TV when Jeopardy comes on.
Get away. Take whatever tape you got in the thing, take it out, go. Get out of my house. So I had to watch Braveheart in sequences, right? Because you couldn't get through it. I couldn't get it through it all at once. Got home from school, popped in Braveheart, watch half hour of that, pop that out, and then go back and argue with the Blockbuster guide to rent it for a couple more weeks. That was fun and exciting times. I did learn the art of negotiation, though. But I remember, like, at the end of Braveheart, I was stunned. I was like, I can't believe that the Lethal Weapon guy, that came out of him. And every single film that Mel Gibson has directed subsequently has been variations of the themes that were in Braveheart. And he's been a remarkably consistent director, regardless of what you think about his personal life. He's been a remarkably consistent director. And to his credit, he only takes projects that he's actually viscerally interested in. You saw this with Passion of the Christ, regardless of what you may think about the content of it. You saw this with Passion of the Christ. And and it's the ultimate like independent distribution film ever. I mean, $600 million that thing made worldwide, not including DVD sales and streaming, where, I mean, that guy probably made $1 billion off of that movie. Yeah. That's insane. And he did it because he was passionate about that subject. That's absolutely nuts.
Yeah, I agree.
And no one else cared.
And I never really think of him as a director either. Like, that's the other thing. you know, and I think of like my favorite directors. I mean, Spielberg, Cameron, everyone loves everyone. You can't love movies without loving Spielberg.
Oh yeah.
You know, James Cameron. But it's like M. Night Shyamalan is in that category for me. Like if you don't like M. Night Shyamalan, something's wrong with you. Like so, there has to be something wrong with you.
I like Sixth Sense. I think his.
I loved The Village. The concept of that movie was incredible.
Oh yeah, we're gonna do a podcast on this. Oh yeah, we're gonna do an entire episode because I have some thoughts on The Village.
I don't get me wrong, I have thoughts. I said the concept of the movie was incredible.
The Happening. What did you think of The Happening?
Same thing. I like the concept. There were some weird things in there, but you know, again, but M. Night Shyamalan made his living on being weird. Like he knew that's what he wanted. He wanted people to walk out the theater and go, dude, that guy's weird. Like, right. What was he thinking? The Sixth Sense was the only one that wasn't really weird. That was really good. I like, you know, but again, just to let you know, about 15 minutes into it, I'm like, he's dead. Like, I knew. I was like, what? This movie's gonna be stupid.
Listeners, we are not taking Tom to the movies with us at all. You'll ruin the whole thing. Ever. You can't go.
We just, speaking of movies, we just went to see the new Woody Harrelson movie, Champions.
Oh, how is that?
We really enjoyed it. Now, just as a background, so I grew up with an uncle who was involved in the Special Olympics as an athlete. He was a Special Olympics athlete. Okay. So I spent a lot of time around these types of athletes, and the movie depicts them so accurately. Like I thought it was very well done. Like just from somebody who kind of lived it. Woody Harrelson was incredible. I thought Kate Olsen was great. Like they're really good. But the athletes made the movie. And of course, now I'm sitting there with my significant other. We're watching the movie, and she's like, "Oh, I'm not gonna. This is a little bit of a spoiler, a little bit, just a little bit."
Okay, we'll put a spoiler alert.
I'm gonna try to make it as generic as I can, so it doesn't ruin the whole movie. But it's like, you know, so she's like, "Oh, so and so is gonna," because it's a basketball movie, so I can say he's gonna hit this shot, and you're not gonna know what I'm talking about, right? So. Right. Oh, so and so is gonna hit that shot to win the game. You watch, and I went, "No, he's not." She was like, and then the movie progresses, and she looked at me. She goes, "You suck." Like,
I hate you.
Overall, good movie though. Good movie though. The movie that surprised me the most recently though was Cocaine Bear.
I have heard so many good things from so many random people who never talk about movies walking up to me and talking with me about that at jiu-jitsu, or if I'm at the gym, or you know, weirdly enough at church. I'm like, you're church people, why are you watching that movie? But I've heard so many good things, and you're like now the fourth or fifth person.
If you like humor and you like it to be just left of center, it's very good.
Okay, that's your thing. Okay.
If you, because like think of the movies like Zombieland, like, you know, movies that are funny but they're just left of center, like left of center. They're off a little bit. You have to be a special kind of person to think this is funny. Like, you know, like.
Well, I mean, look at the title, Cocaine Bear. I mean, look at the title. Let's be real here.
You know, we're sitting in the theater. I'm sitting with my kids, and we go to the movies probably 3 or 4 times a month. Like we're at the movies all the time. And they're like, Dad, this movie's based on a true story. I went, whoa, time out. This movie is loosely based on a true story. Let's just make sure we understand this.
Words matter.
Based. Yes, there was a bear that got a hold of a brick of cocaine. Yes, the bear ate the cocaine. The bear went nuts, killed 2 people, and then died of a heart attack, all within about 25 minutes. The movie is an hour and a half long. It didn't last that long. Like the whole Cocaine Bear incident did not last as long as this movie. And the movie depicts longer than an hour and a half. So the bear did not do all these things that it's just not that way. But it is very fun. I liked it. I enjoyed it. I thought it was, you know, the other thing that I thought was interesting about this movie, it's an hour and a half, right? 90 minutes runtime. Yeah. So it goes back to the movies like of the 80s and 90s where it was like taboo to do a 2-hour movie, right? Like you didn't like you said Braveheart, that was like a rarity. Like we didn't see those length of movies. Now it's like 2 hours, 2.5 hours, 3-hour movies, nothing.
I tell my kids, this is part of the reason why I struggle with new things, because it's like, if you can't write a script that gets you out, if you can't write a script for a movie that's under 90 minutes or 90 minutes that holds my attention, 90 minutes that holds my attention, you can't write your way out of a paper bag. You just can't. But I also think, and this is another dynamic, I think you have, because when you look at the end credits, I mean, how many freaking people are working on movies now?
Yeah,
you know,
yeah, right.
So I remember a movie like the Ten Commandments, right? Ben-Hur, back in the day, right? Ben-Hur had how many thousands of extras, giant cast. You've got Heston, you got big names, right, from back in the day. And yet I don't think more than 100 people worked on that film.
Right.
Now you've got cinematography, you've got sound design, you've got DP, you've got production, you've got gaffers, you've got all that. Plus you have an entire explosion of special effects people, all of whom have to get paid, all of whom contribute to the film. And don't get me wrong, they should get paid. I'm not arguing that they shouldn't. I'm saying that explosion of personnel on the film, I think, has gone a long way to justifying a 2-hour runtime or a 2-hour plus runtime, because you have to justify those people's jobs. You have to justify those people's positions. And by the way, look, if it's an Avengers movie that's 2 hours that holds my attention, cool, fine, right? But if it's a movie like The Eternals, and I know there's some of you who might have enjoyed The Eternals, God bless you. Sorry, you could probably have done that in 90 minutes. You probably could have tightened that up, right? Or Black Panther, Wakanda Forever. You probably could do that in a 90-minute runtime. I'm sorry, you just could. Now, does that justify all those people's jobs for Disney and for Marvel and for Pixar? No, probably not. But this is the economics of film that we're now seeing. And the economics of film is really pushing sort of creative decisions that are being made. And by the way, always has. But now it's kind of, particularly since the early 2000s, and I would argue with the success of the 3 Lord of the Rings movies, with the success of those 3 films, that was just massive, and it was totally unexpected. That has actually pushed the economics of film further than was previously that was previously pushed mostly by James Cameron, because James Cameron pushed it in the 80s, and then the 90s were kind of a little bit of a tranche, a little bit of a trough. I mean, you had Braveheart in there, and then The Matrix, everybody was going on about bullet time. But once The Fellowship of the Ring, Two Towers, and Return of the King hit, and once Peter Jackson showed that you could do brilliant cinematography on location, make it look like Fantasyland, even though it's reality. Oh, and by the way, have really hyper attention to production and costume and design and a structure of a story. And it all rests on this mythology that's been around for now 100 years, and it worked. You're off to the races now. Yeah,
I agree. But so to that point, Cocaine Bear, 90 minutes, worth the 90 minutes.
That's worth the 90 minutes.
You know what I mean? Like that didn't happen.
And how long were the credits? Is probably like 10 people worked on that movie. Because what, you need the animation for the bear?
What is the average movie right now? The credits are about 6 to 8 minutes.
Yeah, it's about 16 minutes.
It was probably 4. It was probably like 3 or 4 minutes. So it was okay. Yeah, I mean, the cast was short. They didn't have a tremendous amount of people in it. But to your point, the rest of the credits are taken up by all the key grips and the gas.
Yeah, exactly. The dolly guy. There's 8 people holding a dolly. Really?
No joke. Lunch provided by so and so. I can't remember what it said, but I was cracking up when I saw that. I was like, "Wait, are you the caterer? The caterer is in the credits? What on God's green earth are we doing here, people?"
We're giving the caterer a credit because the caterer had to feed 500 people.
And by the way, they got paid for it. It's not like you didn't pay them. What do you put them in the credits for? What the hell? Did they give you a discount to get put in the credits? I don't even understand what's going on here.
Oh my god.
Anyway.
All right. Well, with that, we have now wrapped up the Leadership Lessons of the Great Books podcast. I want to thank my co-host Tom Libby for coming on, having a wide-ranging conversation. Please go out, folks, and pick your top 5 films and email us your top 5. We would be more than happy to to take that kind of feedback and listen to that on the show. I want to thank everybody who has contributed to us getting to 50 episodes and to us getting to over 100 episodes in toto. Please keep listening. Please keep providing me feedback, talking to me in real life, sending me emails, messages, direct and otherwise, commenting on all of our social platforms.
I'll give you some feedback right away live here for you, Jesan. I think we should do another episode like this when you hit 100 or somewhere around there, like 100, with all of your co-hosts on the same podcast with you. We can make that happen. Like that, or something. Like that.
we can make that happen. I've been cogitating on an idea, around that. Oh yeah, a giant panel discussion that might be it might be a little bit challenging, but might be fun, I think that would be real. I think it might be fun. Yeah, that's actually not a bad idea.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your sign off. Go for it.
No. We'll work on that. You can learn from anywhere, anytime. You can learn from any book, and from books as wide ranging as The Way of the Samurai, all the way to President George Washington's Thanksgiving Day Proclamation. You can learn something as a leader. You can take something from everything that's in this world. This provides context for the truth of leadership, in that it is both an art and a science. Obviously, we want to honor where that truth comes from, and we want to honor the words that back it up. But we also want to be able to flip the script, right? We want to be able to contextualize our knowledge and contextualize our experience so that we can indeed take the best action we possibly can and be the types of leaders that can appreciate literature, can contextualize it for others, and they can take those lessons and continue to build towards a more perfect union, such as it were. Once again, I want to thank my guest, Tom, Libby, for coming on today. And with that, I'm out. Listen and subscribe to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast on all the major podcast players that you listen to podcasts on, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and even Spotify. And please leave a 5-star review if you like the show. We need those reviews to grow, and it's the easiest way to make sure that this show gets into the ears of the leaders who need to hear it. And of course, tell all your friends. If you want to get started on the leadership path, HSCT Publishing's products and services can help your team do that. Check out our training webinars, coaching services, and more at leadershiptoolbox.us. We also have a video-based subscription service, that's software as a service, that can help your team become better at the individual level. 60 modules and over 100 hours of video and written content for you at leadingkeys.com. That's leadingkeys.com. We've also got books that will help you and your team grow. Pick up a copy today of My Boss Doesn't Care, 100 essays on disrupting your workplace by disrupting your boss, and subscribe to the Little Red podcast I launched earlier this year with the same name as that Little Red book. My most recent book is 12 Rules for Leaders, the Foundation of Intentional Leadership. Co-written with contributions from Bradley Madigan, this is the book for right now that was written for leaders right now. Pick up a copy by heading over to 12rulesleadersbook.com/now. That's 12rulesleadersbook.com/now. You pay for shipping, and you'll get a copy of my second book as well. Finally, you can get all these books in paperback, hardcover, or as ebooks on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, and any other place online you order books. Finally, HSCT Publishing is on YouTube. Like and subscribe to the video version of the Leadership Lessons for the Great Books podcast on the HSCT Publishing channel on YouTube. Just search for HSCT Publishing and hit the subscribe button. You'll get our weekly video updates, which is the video version of this podcast. And of course, you're going to want to subscribe to my other podcast. That's right, I do more than one. The Jesan Sorrells Presents audio experience, where I talk more casually with a broader range of people about all matters that matter in the world today, from arts all the way to analytics. All right, that's it for me.